Hi there, Ronnie here, Amber's Night. This is part 2 on my thoughts for beginning GMs, and it's really to expand upon my sort of first rule, which is know your system and pick it well. Um, I am a firm believer that a beginning GM should always use a fairly rules light, simple game for a beginner game. My reason for this is fairly simple. I think a beginner GM has enough on their plate and is nervous enough and uh, awkward enough on a first game without using a complex set of rules to add to that. Back when I started out, the go-to systems were pretty much, if you were a fantasy gamer, either D&D Basic, which for all its faults in hindsight is a very good beginner system, and I would still hold it up as a really good beginner system even today. And Dragon Warriors, which I actually started gaming just about the time that came out, so it was perfect timing for me. And I actually like Dragon Warriors. I think it's a great game. I would also add that the re-release by Mungus Publishing of Dragon Warriors is hard to get as a published book now. You pay a fortune for it, but you can buy it pretty easily on PDF, and it's worth getting. Failing that game, talking about fantasy games, there are a hell of a lot of retro clones out there. Everything from Labyrinth Lord to Dark Dungeons to Mazes and Minotaurs. There are a slew of them. D6 Fantasy, which is a very generic fantasy set of rules based on the D6 system that used to power the old Star Wars game. It's a very simple set of rules. The only problem I have with D6 is a lack of a setting to put the games in. But there are a couple of books that you can get. There's a D6 creatures, fantasy creatures, and a D6 fantasy locations. And you can get them all free from drivethrurpg.com, and you just print them out. So there's plenty of simplistic systems out there to find. I know a lot of people love games like D&D 3.5, the whole OGL line. Some people like D&D 4th edition, and Pathfinder seems to be huge at the moment. And whilst the mechanics of the game are very simple, and they are very straightforward, it's roll a d20, add and subtract some modifiers, try and reach a target number. It's a perfectly simple system to use. There are so many options and tweaks and levers and buttons and this and that to push and pull. I think it would be overwhelming for a beginner GM. Having said that, as much as I would say use a basic system, use a system that you know really well almost trumps that, and I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, unfortunately, his only ever attempt at GMing, he decided to use the Palladium Fantasy role-playing game. To give some context to his choice, this was in the early 90s. Now, he could have used basic D&D, he could have used MERP, but as much as he liked those games, and he liked using those games, and liked playing those games, Palladium was a game he loved, and he knew it inside and out. So even though it was more complex and complicated than D&D Basic, it was about on the level with MERP, it was the right choice for him because he knew the game so well. So as much as I would say pick a game, pick a rule system that's simple, I would say pick a rule system that works for you, that you know inside and out. You don't have to know each and every possible permutation of a rule, but at least have a good idea where that rule is in the book. That way, if someone does come up with some obscure way of using a rule, you know where to go and find it. And that's what good GMing is. It's about knowing where to go and making a judgment call. I know a lot of GMs and guilty use house rules. I don't use house rules. I'll say this, I don't approve of house rules for beginner GMs. I think you've got enough on your plate with the rules you've got. Run as is. Once you're confident and comfortable enough with a set of rules, then by all means, add some house rules if you want to augment and change things. But use the rules as is. So what games would I recommend? Well, all the ones I've mentioned so far. Basic D&D, if you can still find it. Labyrinth Lord is quite a good system. Dark Dungeons, I mean, they're all fairly similar. Dungeon Slayers, I would say is very good for a beginner's game. D6 Fantasy, providing you get the other two books as well. I would also say Mazes and Minotaurs if you want to run something a little different. Basic fantasy role-playing is not bad as well. You can get that free. Sci-fi, as much as I didn't care for the series, the Serenity role-playing game is actually a very simple system. It uses a system called Cortex, which also powers the Smallville RPG and the Supernatural RPG and the Battlestar Galactica RPG. And it's a very simple system, and if you happen to like that series, the Firefly series or the Serenity movie, then it's a good choice. Traveller, the old Traveller set is not the easiest system, but I've seen a lot worse. If you can find it, Star Wars D6 game is very good. There is a generic space game based on the D6 engine, the D6 Space game. That's another good one to get. For sort of modern day urban fantasy, the aforementioned Supernatural RPG. I wouldn't really recommend the Dresden Files. I think that's a bit much for a beginner GM. I would recommend Buffy. And it's not just because I'm a fan of the show. The actual system is very good. It's a very workable system. And the Angel RPG. And because I'm a huge Amber Benson fan, hence the Amber's Night logo, I would recommend the Ghosts of Albion RPG, which also uses the same system, Uni system. And that's a very good game, sort of Victorian horror fantasy game. There's a lot out there. If it's a game that you're used to playing, Pathfinder, D&D 4, if you're used to playing that game and you're comfortable with that game and you feel you can run with that game, use it. It's not a choice I would make personally, but the most important thing, the most important lesson to learn, it's your game. That is the most important thing. It's your game. You are running it. use the system that works for you. If all the games I mentioned are of no use to you whatsoever, leave them to the side. Pick the game that works for you. So this is part 2, and part 3 I will talk about players and my feeling regarding players for your game. Okay, so this is part 2. Talk to you again.